a week press briefings on Delaware's response to COVID-19 pandemic. We've been coming together now twice a week for the better part of 3 months, and I'm pleased to report some very positive news today as we continue to improve with respect to the presence of the virus in Delaware, Newcastle, Kenton, and Sussex County, as well as our efforts to reopen the economy. As I've been saying from the beginning, this has been an exercise in assuring public health and a strong economy. It's not an either-or proposition, it's a both. At the same time, we've been busy with protests up and down the state, following up on the death there in Minnesota. And we've had a number of protests across Delaware, from Rehoboth Beach to my hometown of Claymont, and towns and communities in between. As we speak, there's a protest going on out along 141 by the Ferris School, and I'm joined today by Colonel Nate McQueen, who's been at the helm, if you will, leading our efforts to protect the rights of individuals to protest and to preserve public safety at the same time, and doing a really outstanding job. The majority of the protests have been peaceful and nonviolent. Yes. We've had a few instances where they devolved into violence, most particularly the event in Wilmington a week ago, and to some extent with the Dover event the next night. We're going to ask the Colonel to talk a little bit about that. We've had some challenges. It's been a busy time with a public health pandemic, unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime, and at the same time dealing with a very traumatic event that has really laid bare some of the more difficult challenges that we face as a country in terms of our history of hate and racism, in terms of our challenges of persistent inequities. And these are, I was a young boy, a young 12-year-old in 1968 when we had riots here in the city of Wilmington. My father at the time was working for the old Wilmington Public School District and came into the city every day for work. And as an impressionable young lad, I followed the events in the paper every day, and it had a lasting, I think, impact on me, and part of my motivation for public service was to address some of these inequities, and the things that I care about most and that we're working on center around making sure that every child in our state has an opportunity to be successful. My dad always used to say that for all the problems that we face as a society, education is the key. I met with a number of the organizers of the protest that's scheduled for today in Wilmington the other day, and I made mention of that, and it didn't go over well initially with folks, because people are very angry with the immediate circumstances around the relationship between law enforcement and the black community in our country, and it's a very difficult history. And one that we need to continue to address, to listen to the protesters. That's a big part of my job. My father used to always say, talk is cheap. He wanted to see action. He didn't want us to say, well, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. He wanted to actually see the behavior that he was looking for. And in the meetings that we had this week, I think that was the general sense that, okay, Governor, talk is cheap. We need to, we want this, we want that, and this is, we've heard that before kind of thing. But it has to start with listening, and it has to start with hearing. For those of us who are entrusted with the positions that we are, leadership positions, that's our obligation, to listen to our constituents and to respond and to address the problems that we have. It hurts my heart to know that my brothers and sisters in our community with African American heritage and people of color are pained this way, experience these things in a deep way. And it's our obligation, it's my obligation, to help turn what could be just negative energy into something that's positive. And one of the really good things coming out of our discussions this week with the protest organizers, with community leaders, with elected officials, with the clergy, is really the commitment to do that. And I think that the proof will be in the pudding, frankly, and talk is cheap. Listening is important, and that's what I intend to do today. Let's turn to the other very traumatic thing happening in our state over the last 3 months, the COVID-19 pandemic. We've got good news this week. Positive cases continue to climb. We're closing in on 10,000 positive cases. We're at 9,700, which is about 10% of our population, if I have the total population number right. We have, sadly, 388 total deaths. That number continues to climb, and it is concentrated mostly among very frail and members of the senior citizen demographic, and so our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, mothers and fathers. But amazingly, our current hospitalization rate continues to decline, which demonstrates an improving situation in terms of the overall health and the seriousness or diminishing seriousness of the illness, and that's a very positive thing, particularly as we open up sectors of our economy. The breakout continues to trend. Newcastle County still has the second most cases at 3,900. Kent County at 1,400, about the same percentage as it's been. And then Sussex County number of cases is actually flattening out a little bit. If you look at the data dashboard we're going to look at in a minute, this is the demographics by age. Nothing's really changed in there. And here's the data dashboard, and you can see the hospitalization rate continuing to improve steadily, day by day, week by week, to the point that we're way under. The peak was 337 back on about April the 25th or so, and it's consistently trended down, even as the number of positive cases, particularly in Sussex County, rose. The next couple of charts are the total cases, new hospital admissions day to day, and as you can see, it tends to be up and down, depending on the seriousness of the illness. The percentage of persons who test positive is another one of our big indicators, so we're doing a whole lot more testing, and so we're going to find more cases, but the percentage of the people tested is continuously going down on that trend that you see there. And again, another indicator that gives us a level of comfort that the community is getting healthier and that we can move to reopen part of our economy. The next chart shows new positive cases. Again, a good trend line there. It tends to be a little up and down. And then the percentage of emergency department visits with influenza or COVID-19 symptoms, and you can see that peak and then the decline on the other side. The final chart there is cases by county. Cumulatively, the total number of cases you can see is starting to flatten out, and the Sussex County number of cases, as you can see, is also flattening out, as is Kent County. Newcastle County still, trending kind of at the same rate, but at an absolute number below Sussex County. On our data dashboard for PPE, personal protective equipment, the glass is full on each of those, and we just get better reports each week about the supply chain there. We do hear now, as businesses open and bring workers back to their establishments, the need for some of the personal equipment in terms of mostly in terms of masks and gloves. Not a lot beyond that, but those are important things. The more I circulate and go into various establishments, this week I was able to get my first haircut in about 3 months. I am so happy to be done with my 1975 version haircut with hair way down the back of my neck, and this feels a lot cooler. Bad news, it also revealed a lot more gray hair. So I guess it's a little bit of mixed. So happy to be in the YMCA, Central YMCA, earlier this week with my mask on. A little bit mixed there in terms of folks with masks and without. It is not required. It's a recommendation depending on the exercise that's being done, and of course all the equipment was appropriately spaced out. If you're assembling today or in other days across our country, across our state, for a protest, we have recommend that you wear a face covering. Probably not something law enforcement would always recommend, but in the case of this pandemic, important practice to the extent possible, keeping distant from one another. And if you have been to an event, you might think about getting tested. We're expanding our testing outreach. A.J. Shaw is not here with us today. He is our point person for testing, working in conjunction here in Newcastle County with the county executive, A.J. Shaw, and they've got a lot of community test sites that are in the schedule, and we would recommend that you go see those at this website, de.gov/coronavirus. You can find those testing locations. You don't have to have symptoms. You can just go and get tested. We need that broader information. We need to have a good handle on the percentage of the population that is positive, whether they're symptomatic or not. We do know that folks that are non-symptomatic have had the infection or have it actively, and that's something, particularly as we attempt to protect vulnerable populations, it's an important thing to know. So we continue to roll forward with interim steps. I had a conversation last week as we had the drive-through at the two veterans cemeteries here in Newcastle County and in Millsboro and Sussex County, and one of our constituents who was on the ride there and in Sussex County was very adamant about the need for tattoo shops to be up and running again, and effective on Monday, June the 8th, these personal care services will be allowed to open with appropriate protection and protective measures. Did get my hair cut, as I said yesterday, and everybody in the shop had their hand sanitizer, wearing masks. I had my mask on, had to unleash it in the back to get the hair in the back, but just feels like people are paying attention, and that's really what we need to see. Private instruction in terms of tutoring and testing services and adult education is opening as well with appropriate protections. One of the big issues that we've been dealing with is sports, particularly youth sports. And so we will have guidance to reopen baseball and softball. I was looking at the specifics of it. It is important to maintain social distancing, refrain from sharing equipment, wiping down surfaces that are touched a lot. I think most kids now have their own bats. When I was playing Little League Baseball, we all use the same 3 or 4 bats. But that's an issue folks ought to take a look at. The issue for baseball and softball over the last several weeks has always been the catcher. We have some guidance for the catcher that's in these recommendations and requirements, and it looks a little different than the baseball that I played as a little leaguer, but important that it's done safely and to prevent the spread of the virus. So we will have more coming out on other sports with a little bit more contact than baseball. We were joking beforehand that in our respective baseball careers that if you ended up playing in the outfield, particularly in right field. There wasn't a lot of activity out there. Wasn't a lot of need for social distancing because you're kind of out there on your own, and not much happened out there. If you're the catcher, that's a little different scenario altogether. But so more information to come. We know that there's tremendous interest in that, and we've been working with various public health officials to come up with the appropriate guidance. We have continued, as I said, the outreach in terms of testing, and one of the areas that we wanted to protect vulnerable populations. We have a number of high-rise senior facilities, particularly in the city of Wilmington, and we had this core of folks out to testing door-to-door in those senior high-rises to identify folks that are COVID-19 positive. Very successful, as I understand. Our thanks go out to this team there on the screen, and to everybody else who helped us go door-to-door in the senior high-rises. And I know those high-rises, they all have the executive committee, if you will, the management committee in those, and we appreciate their cooperation, and all the residents as well. I do see many of them. I have 3 that are on either ends of the Triangle neighborhood that I live in, and so see a lot of those seniors out sitting on the bench, and they're important members of our community. So that's what we've been doing on the COVID-19 public health side. Again, a lot more testing. The National Guard is up with their contact tracing and doing a really good job there, reaching out to folks and identifying people that have come in contact with somebody who's tested positive, tried to encourage them to test positive, and very pleased with the way that's going. Again, our partnership with the hospitals continues, still working out kind of the new relationship there. Most of their testing was at sites, near their campuses. They did do some community testing more recently, and most of that's being done by Newcastle County here in Newcastle County, and by our testing team and the hospitals in Kent and Sussex County. Great partnership with Bay Health, with BB and Nanticoke downstate, of course, Christiana Care, St. Francis, and AI DuPont up here in Newcastle County. So with that, we've had some challenges. I don't think any Secretary of Labor has had to deal with the issues that Saran Cade has had to deal with over the last 3 months, and he and his team have really leaned into the incredible onslaught of calls that they've gotten, applications for unemployment. One of the issues early on was unemployment for private contractors and non-employees, if you will, and we had a little bit of a technical glitch there, and Saran's here to give you some data, and it's just the numbers are staggering. There was a good, by the way, employment number today, which is a really good sign. Beat all expectations from the economists, which is a good thing nationally. I think the numbers here in Delaware were pretty good as well. Really concentrated in certain industries that were closed, restaurants, hospitality, that type of thing, and really does, say to you, and I've seen this week as we've allowed restaurants to reopen, to go back to your favorite restaurant and, and buy a meal much like you did take out while they were closed. But, we need to help our restaurants. We need to help our personal care providers. I gave the lady who cuts my hair a little bit extra, as if I had gotten a couple haircuts during this period of time, and we all ought to think about that, think about our neighbor during a very challenging time. Secretary Cade.
Thank you, Governor. So unemployment in the state of Delaware, we are seeing, as the governor mentioned, some positive signs of recovery. We're still nowhere near where, of course, we were when this crisis began, but we are seeing some improvement. As you can see in last week's initial claims of 3,052 initial claims, probably the lowest amount that we've received since this crisis began. Keep in mind, though, that's still about 6 times what we received before this crisis. So our bar has definitely risen with regard to positive news. Last week we paid out $45 million in unemployment benefits. That number's also dipped just a little bit. If you look at that box of total benefits paid, you'll see unemployment benefits of $327 million that have been paid out. Of that, the federal government's benefits are $209 million, and what's come from the Unemployment Trust Fund is $117 million. So, of course, staggering numbers that we've seen, and all of that represents what has been paid out since this crisis began in March 15th. The 103,000 initial claimants that we see, just to give you some context, that accounts for probably about just over 20% of the state's civilian workforce who has initially claimed for unemployment. Obviously, our unemployment rate is lower than that, and the reason for that discrepancy is that based on some of the expanded unemployment benefit rules that were issued in March, we do allow for individuals who are working part-time to collect unemployment, and they wouldn't be considered as unemployed. So if you're working, if you went from full-time employment and your hours were reduced significantly, currently you can still apply for unemployment. That will be very helpful as we get through the recovery, since there are a lot of businesses who are going to be coming back online and may not be going to a full staff immediately and may need to phase in employment, that some of their workers may still be able to collect some benefit depending on what their earnings are for that week. Another important number here is the 69% of benefits paid. For those who probably pay attention to this document that we send out weekly, last week I think we were close to about 80%. The reason that we had that significant drop is that last week we started paying out benefits for independent contractors and self-employed workers through PUA for the first time. So adding that population to the population that we're now tracking how often they're receiving their benefit has definitely dropped that number. That's a good sign. That means that we've actually started making benefit payments to these workers. If we go to the next slide, we're going to spend the rest of our time just talking about pandemic unemployment assistance. As many people have seen around the country, this set part of the CARES Act provided unemployment benefits to individuals who would traditionally not qualify for state unemployment. These are independent contractors, self-employed workers, also individuals who work for faith-based organizations, people who may not have earned enough over the previous 4 quarters to qualify for unemployment benefits. So I would probably say that there are far more ways that you can qualify for pandemic unemployment than you could not qualify for it, as it's been outlined in federal law.
This is new. I mean,
this is a brand new program, and I'll give some brief context as to the timeline. So pandemic unemployment assistance was passed by Congress in the CARES Act on March 27th of this year. The state of Delaware, as well as our sister states around the country, received actual federal regulations and guidelines on April 11th as to how they wanted that program to be rolled out. 5 days later, after that federal regulatory guidance came out, the Department of Labor had issued a statement. We issued a statement stating that we had hired a contractor, or vendor rather, to help us develop this system, which would need to be an online database that could collect personal and private information in order to interface with our traditional 30-plus-year-old mainframe system. So that was April 16th that we issued, or I think April 16th or 17th that we issued that statement. By May 16th, the system was up and running, and we began collecting information from and allowing individuals to apply. Obviously, as we rolled the website out, there were some glitches on the first day, but by that night, individuals were able to start applying for unemployment benefits that are independent contractors. Since that time, the federal government has still released guidance and guidelines that determine how this process needs to work. Majority of that is focused on addressing fraud that we've seen around the country, from sophisticated fraud rings that have been using and people's identities to apply for unemployment benefits. So we've seen in states like Rhode Island, Washington State, Massachusetts, hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud due to identity theft. And so the Office of Inspector General and the U.S. Department of Labor has been working with states to try to mitigate that as much as possible. Obviously, this has an impact on the amount of time it may take to process some of these claims. Again, these individuals who are applying for unemployment have never had to provide data or wage information to the Department of Labor before. And once they do, we have to vet that out, verify it, and determine what these individuals are owed. Since June 4th, which is when we started issuing payments, we've paid out 1,100. I've received an email today. We're processing payments every day. So I received an email today that's actually probably 200 more than that. So close to about 1,300 benefits have been paid thus far, or processing, or should be paid today or early tomorrow. That equates to about $5.4 million in benefits paid in just pandemic unemployment alone. That's probably just below $5,000 per claimant that they would be, on average, that they've been receiving in benefits. Total that we've received thus far is $27 million worth of benefits requests, so which includes the $5 million that have been paid out over the last few days. So definitely making tremendous progress there, but of course nowhere near where we would like to be. There was a issue that popped up over the weekend, which we made a statement about on our social media page, and I think a couple of news services picked it up as well. There was a glitch during our first payment run. We had originally planned to pay out, I think, maybe about 300 some odd claimants on the first payment just to test out the system. Unfortunately, the system had identified about 3,000 people rather than the 300 that were supposed to be paid. And for claimants, when they looked at their screen on Friday, many of them saw that their payment had been approved and was processed. Later on, after that weekend, our IT team identified the problem, identified the concern, went back and fixed it, and a lot of people woke up the next day realizing that their claim had not been processed, and were understandably very upset because of that. We made a statement to let folks know what occurred, and that their claims are still being processed, and they should have them in due time as we go through the internal process of vetting them out as effectively as we possibly can. But we definitely understand the concern. People have been, some of these independent contractors, people who may work as nail salons or barbers. I'm happy the governor was able to get his hair cut. My barber probably will not be cutting my hair until I get him his pandemic unemployment assistance benefits. So until then, I've got to figure it out on my own. But we're very confident that this process is going to be moving pretty quickly now, since we started getting the first payments out and getting the system underway. One thing that we really would like to point out is that not all claimants who applied actually submitted the required documentation. So of the 6,000 who have applied, we probably have, probably a little more than half actually provided documentation to show their wages. We just have to remind people that pandemic unemployment assistance is not a program that's solely based on need. According to the federal law, you also have to qualify for it. So just because there is definitely a need for funding for this resource, you have to qualify by showing that you were earning wages or earnings while you were working while you were an independent contractor or self-employed. You have to show that if you can't show that you had earnings last year, you have to be able to show that you have pay stubs or anything that would show that you were working sometime this year. So those documents would be 1099 documents, 1040s if you're self-employed individual, W-2s, tax returns, things like that. Having this documentation makes it very, very, makes the job much easier on our team who are, investigating many of these claims or processing many of these claims. Without having this, it forces staff to use other means to determine your eligibility, and that may take a lot longer than we really would like for it to take. So I just would remind people, once you apply for pandemic unemployment assistance, we're still giving you 21 days after you apply so that you could come back and provide this documentation that can be added to your claims so that it can be processed with all the information. Right now, we're reviewing claims that have submitted 2019 documentation. We're trying to get some of the easiest claims out of the way first. And so these are people who have uploaded, who may have filed taxes already this year and have tax return statements from 2019. This would include individuals who may not be independent contractors or self-employed, but may just not have had enough income over the last year to qualify for unemployment. These are people who still have W-2s and other documents that we could use. We're working with the Department of Finance to make sure that we can validate information for individuals, to make sure that we're addressing fraud, to make sure that these individuals are paying taxes, paying state taxes. And so the process for addressing these or getting these pandemic unemployment assistance benefits out is definitely a little bit different, or a lot different than our traditional system. Let's see if we got anything else. So the next slide will just identify how to get in contact with the Department of Labor. When this process first began and we had our high weeks of 20,000 claims in a week, I know there were some concerns about the call times and not being able to get into the system to make phone calls or to talk to anyone. Those issues have been essentially rectified for the most part. Not to say that there may not be a hold for people, but you should be able to wait on hold to talk to someone. I try to stay as tied to social media and our call center as much as I can to try to keep a finger on the pulse of whether or not there's some progress being made there. And it seems that there are. For the people who are upset, at this point they're upset because of something that someone told them over the phone, which means that at least they can get through and talk to someone. Now we just got to make sure that we can get them the assistance that they need when they call in. So those are three numbers that we would advocate for people who need to talk to someone about their claim. Follow the prompts. You will have to listen to some automated messages so that you can see if you can utilize our self-help options before you attempt to talk to someone. And from there, following the prompts for general questions should lead you to the whole queue where you can have a conversation with someone about your claim. Also, we have email addresses. I want to be clear that there's a separate email for individuals who have PUA claims. We want to make sure that we keep those separate from the general email list for unemployment benefits so that we can address them as quickly as possible. We've identified a specific team who will be addressing PUA claims, which is different from our team that are addressing the traditional unemployment claims. And so this team will be manning that PUA claims email address. We know that you filed your benefit and you're waiting for your assistance. We just say for those who have not received their benefit yet, make sure that you have all of the documentation that we have outlined sent in. If you forgot to send it in and you're unable to do it on the website, send that information into the DE PUA claims website. Also urge people from a standpoint of making sure that we reduce incidents of fraud or identity theft. Please try not to send your full email address through your full social security number through these. All we need is your last four. We don't need you to send your full email address to our emails or, God forbid, on social media or anything along those lines. Again, our website is ui.delawareworks.com, and I look forward to any other questions that you may have.
Thank you, Secretary Kay. Very unprecedented time for the Department of Labor with the onslaught of claims for unemployment. And the independent contractor is very new. It is not a normal benefit under unemployment, and these extraordinary times require extraordinary action, and the federal government was good enough to do that, to make those resources available to folks, and really important. And had the glitch and working through that, and we'll get to the other side quickly. It's been a busy week as I said, fighting the pandemic here on the ground, as well as dealing with protests up and down our state, mostly positive. Nobody's been busier than Colonel Nate McQueen, who's the superintendent of Delaware State Police, and also, I guess, the confirmed appointee to be the next Secretary of Public Safety. We've not sworn you in yet, so I guess you got kind of two hats on, but doing an extraordinary job under difficult circumstances, so we appreciate your presence today to comment on kind of what we've seen this week and the approach of Delaware State Police and other law enforcement agencies. Thanks, Colonel McQueen.
Thank you, Governor. Good afternoon. I note to the Governor's point earlier, the relationship between police and the minority community is impacted by many historical and certainly social influences, and we certainly have work to do on both ends. Governor asked me today to talk a little bit about some of the events over the last week, and so I'll just kind of outline a few of those and just talk briefly about some of those events. Over the course of the last week, we've had approximately 13 protests up and down the state. Some of those areas include Rehoboth, Georgetown, Claymont, Middletown, Dover, Newark, Frankfort, and we have several scheduled throughout the rest of the weekend and throughout the beginning of next week as well. Our role in some of those protests to date have been what they've always been. They've been to support local law enforcement and to continue to focus on the safety and wellness of our state. Our role to date has been I'll start with the two protests that started on Saturday. One that started in Wilmington started obviously as a peaceful protest and continued through most of the day. Protesters exercised their First Amendment right in the city of Wilmington. There was a movement up to 95 that most folks had the opportunity to witness that also was peaceful, and at some point returned back to the city of Wilmington. That event largely was managed by Wilmington Police all day long, and again, a mostly peaceful protest. Unfortunately, that protest deteriorated overnight, and Wilmington also called for the assistance of additional law enforcement officers, to include the state police and Newcastle County Police. Ultimately, that event ended overnight. The following night, we had a similar event in the city of Dover, again managed largely by Dover Police Department. That event throughout most of the day continued peaceful, mostly along the areas of Dover Police Department, around Legislative Hall, in the local Dover area, and that protest unfortunately turned a little bit unfriendly toward the end of the evening. They had some looting and some violence along the areas of the Route 13, and that protest ultimately ended at actually at the state police headquarters in Dover, where it was ultimately resolved peacefully. Other events that we've had throughout the state, like I said, we've had approximately 11 other events that have been, again, a great exercise in the First Amendment rights on the part of our citizens. They exercise their rights. They've engaged the police in some cases, engaged their other community leaders, and those events have been peaceful and have worked very well throughout the state. Again, our role is initially for the state police is to sort of assist local law enforcement in anything they may need. That usually starts out with the form of intelligence on the part of either us or on the part of that agency, or information that we receive nationally events that may be occurring in Delaware. So what we do is reach out to those agencies with any intelligence we may have. They may share any intelligence they may have about a specific event, and then we work together to determine what resources may be needed to successfully manage that event and to keep our community safe. And those resources generally will include the assistance starting with intelligence, may end up being special operations, may also at some point end up being additional resources in terms of other law enforcement officers, and sometimes those resources may also include equipment from our agency and sharing equipment up and down the state, and then determining what additional resources are needed, again, to successfully resolve those events. So that's kind of a sense of where we are. Talk a little bit about, again, the events of Dover. I had the fortune of being down there on that night, and having listened to the protesters and what their concerns were, I think law enforcement up and down the state respects their right to have those conversations, to exercise their First Amendment rights, and their right to do it peacefully with our protection, and also keeping in mind the protection of the larger public, and our role to protect life and property across the state in all of those communities. And so after having dialogue with them and actually speaking with the crowd, I don't know that we agreed to disagree. We agreed that there's a work to be done, One, they have to have their right to have their voices heard, and law enforcement has to hear those voices, and at the larger government and the community have to move forward to make whatever necessary changes we need to make that relationship work. Delaware law enforcement only works when we work with our communities. The law enforcement community in Delaware, surprisingly, is not as significant as most think, but we have enough officers in the state to protect the state, and the only way we do that is working with our communities. 960,000 is a lot stronger than the law enforcement officers that we have within the state. And we take the responsibility very seriously, but we also understand that we can't do it without the community. And our rights to protect the communities comes from the citizens. Our policy in terms of Delaware State Police, it starts with citizens. Our goal is to go out there, get good citizens, train them well, give them good policy, good oversight, and hold them accountable for what they do going forward. Every agency in Delaware, and I'm sure across the country, strives to do that. But again, the accountability piece has to be on both ends. The public has to hold us accountable, and we have to hold ourselves accountable. And we try to do that every day. And when there's times that we don't, and we need additional resources going forward, it's time to come back to the table and continue to find ways as a society to continue to move law enforcement forward. And we are committed to doing that, and having talked with the rest of the chiefs in the state over the last week, they are all committed to moving that process forward. The thing that makes Delaware work is that we can sit in the room with every chief in the state in one room and get processes moving forward, looking at good policy and good procedures going forward. And we can manage that as a state, working in conjunction with our communities, with all of our law enforcement partner, and obviously our Attorney General's office and the citizens of Delaware. So that's our ultimate goal, is to do that going forward. To talk a little bit about, sort of what our goal is for the community going forward, again, we have to work with our communities. And again, our number one goal is to protect life and property, whether that's in use of force situations or whether it's with these events that are happening up and down our state. What I would ask you to do is to, if you have suspicious activity or you are witnessing a crime, to call your local police department. They are your first resource. Nobody knows these communities better than the citizens that live there. They know when something's out of place. They know if a member of the community does not belong there, or if they see some activity that is suspicious to them. So call your local police department and let them at least investigate those incidents. We also ask that when you really see something suspicious and you have a tip for law enforcement, that you call Delaware Crime Stoppers at 1-800-TIP-3333. And lastly, if you have something in the area of anti-terrorism tip line, is 1-800-FORCE-12. And finally, we'd ask that you would call 911 in the event of an emergency. Those incidents that need immediate attention, we request that you call 911. And lastly, I'd like to say, we've had these events up and down the state, and again, we have received tremendous support from our community in all those areas to make sure that these events are held peacefully. We've worked in collaboration with a lot of the organizers and developed a plan to keep these communities safe. All of our organizers that we've dealt with so far, their goal at the outset of these events and at the conclusion of these events is to make sure that Delaware citizens are safe and that they have their opportunity to exercise their right. And as we see these events moving forward out throughout the rest of the day and out throughout the rest of next week that we've already forecast, again, we hope those things occur safely and, again, allowing our community to exercise their First Amendment rights. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Colonel McQueen. Hopefully, be able to call you Mr. Secretary sometime real soon. I do want to thank you for your leadership, frankly, your humble servant leadership. I appreciated your sharing the story of how the protest ended on Sunday night in front of the DSP headquarters there in Dover. Not surprisingly, you understated your role in that, and I would hope that you would toot your own horn, but I expected that you wouldn't, and you didn't. But what I've been told was the protest, which lasted for several hours and was not the greatest situation at times, ended when you grabbed the bullhorn yourself, said essentially what you just said here in terms of the fact that there has to be respect on both sides, and that you respected the right of the protesters to come and to protest as long as it was peaceful, that you all as Delaware State Police have a very important role to protect person and property, and ultimately the crowd dispersed. And it's that kind of leadership, frankly. It's that kind of approach that we have to have. It's that kind of leadership, that kind of approach, that humble servant leadership that respects the relationship, the constitutional rights of all of our citizens, the need for law enforcement to have that relationship with the community, respect the rights of every individual, and to do the very difficult but important job that you all have in the way that you did on Sunday night, and that you and the men and women of Delaware State Police and local police up and down our state. You went through 13, I think, protests, and in each case, pretty much I think in each and every case, it was local law enforcement, local town, county, municipal police departments that were the lead of the Delaware State Police in support. Obviously, there were areas where Delaware State Police was the lead, and so we thank you for that, and we appreciate you being here and your support. Whether you're talking about the challenges that we face with the COVID-19 pandemic, or whether you're talking about the challenges that we face with these very serious inequities that exist in our society, with our need to repair relationships among our citizens of color in our state, particularly as it relates to law enforcement. The way we're going to do it is if we work together. It really is, in that way, that simple, and it's hard. It requires frank, difficult conversations. I would recommend to everyone the opinion piece that Mayor Perzicki had in the paper today, a very thoughtful, I thought, piece that talked about the very difficult history and the challenging conversations that we need to have. We're prepared to do that. It's my responsibility as governor to do that. It's all of our responsibilities in my cabinet to make sure that that is consistent with what we do every day and the things that we do every day. And if we do, we're going to get through it. We're going to be successful. We'll be stronger on the other side. I met with the protest organizers this week, and kind of that was my point. Talk is cheap. As my dad used to say, I want to see action. And ultimately, our response, the action we take, will be the measure of our intention and our sincerity, and that's what we expect to do. So we have some media in the room. I see Sarah out there, and other questions that have been submitted in advance. So why don't you have some, Sarah, if you want to take the lead, it's your microphone, or you can wait till we address some of the other questions that have been pre-submitted. Thanks for coming.
How are you, Governor?
I'm okay. I've had better weeks, but I'm okay.
Do you plan on sending the National Guard to the protest tonight?
So we've got a plan that's been put together by local law enforcement to protest in the city of Wilmington. So it'll be Wilmington Police Department with the lead, with support from Delaware State Police and Newcastle County Police. We always have the Guard on, in a backup role, and that'll be the approach tonight.
So under what circumstances would you send them?
Yeah, it's kind of not really appropriate, but again, as a backup support role.
Okay. So Wilmington is expected to close city streets today. Do you plan on closing the streets? If so, which streets and when?
Yeah, again, the approach, the response is being coordinated by Wilmington PD, and so they're the ones that are closing the streets and providing accommodations, parking accommodations, and directing people to various areas that want to come to the protests, and they're doing that with public safety in mind, and we, Delaware State Police and Newcastle County Police are, as I said, in a supportive role to that.
Do we know which streets and when they will be closed?
I have a general sense as to what streets. They're mostly kind of around, the protest is supposed to start at Tubman Garrett Park. They're right on the riverfront, march the short walk there to the Newcastle County Courthouse. And so most of the streets in kind of that general area, so I don't have the specific numbers. I think there's being some information provided to folks who are looking to attend as to where, they could find surface parking.
Okay, thank you, Governor.
Thank you.
From Delaware Public Media, does Delaware require more federal coronavirus aid? Specifically, does the state need assistance to smooth budget shortfalls? If so, when might Delaware need that assistance by in order to support the 2021 budget?
Yeah, every state in the nation, every government in the nation, I would say, requires additional assistance, or at least the ability to use CARES Act funding or other federal funding to replace revenue loss, which is, I think, what you're talking about. Currently, the Federal CARES Act and other federal funding goes to specific expenditure items that Secretary Kay talked about in his area. It goes specifically to expenses that weren't in your normal budget that were in response to COVID-19, for instance, the testing plan that we're implementing, the contact tracing plan. Some of the unemployment insurance would qualify for that. Support for small businesses would qualify for that. So there's a lot of needs out there. There is an endpoint for that spending, which it could be problematic, the end of this calendar year. And we'll be doing testing and contact tracing way into next year. And so there is a need for at least some flexibility in the federal money. Federal money is incredibly important. Independent contractors wouldn't be helped without it. We wouldn't have the ability to replenish our unemployment fund without it. So many things. And our congressional delegation, Senator Carper, Senator Coons, and Congresswoman Blunt Rochester are to be commended, and the rest of the Democrats and Republicans for that. But we do need flexibility, and it is the number one priority of the National Governors Association, so every governor in the country.
From Katie Tabling at Delaware Business Times, she asks, how are you balancing public health concerns with your desire to help the tourism community get some movement over the next 90 days? Yeah,
that's a really good question. The first and most important is reopening that sector, right? So we eliminated the short-term rental ban. We eliminated the out-of-state travel 14-day quarantine requirement. We've allowed restaurants to open up at limited capacity. We've given them the ability to expand their outside footprint for dining, and I've seen scores of restaurants that have been doing that. In fact, in Rehoboth Beach, I'm told they're taking away parking spaces so restaurants can expand out into those areas, which is a really big help because it's a numbers game at some point. And we will be increasing the number of people allowed in restaurants as we go into the next phase. And so that's a big part of it, welcoming people back to Delaware and encouraging them to come back. We think we have the best beaches, the best restaurants at the beaches, the best communities and accommodations at the beaches here in Delaware, and we need to do a lot of marketing of that.
Jeff Balk at Radio Rehoboth says, several business owners and staff have shared with us experiences of customers entering their stores without wearing face coverings. Most customers are apologetic and put them on, but there is a percentage, though, that express their frustration and then turn around and leave the business. These businesses do have notices posted at their door and around the business. Do you have any suggestion on how to deal with situations like this?
Well, it sounds like they're doing the things that they should do. I mean, they're requiring people to wear masks until they sit at their table with their own household. That's a requirement, an important one. And folks just need to think of others, and we need to continue to get that message out. Some people aren't going to follow the rules. I think they're being selfish when they do that because they aren't thinking of others. We had a demonstration earlier this week about respiratory particles, which is we know how the virus is is transmitted, and it showed very clearly on the screen here the difference between somebody who didn't have a mask on and somebody who did. As I mentioned earlier, I went to the YMCA for the first time, and there were people, as they're allowed to do, working out under certain exercises where they didn't have a mask on. Some of them didn't care. They just didn't wear their mask, and that's just not thoughtful. In fact, I had to move away from one machine because the person just wasn't making any effort at all. My appeal to everybody is, if we want to stay open, if we want to manage this virus, then wearing a mask that might be a little bit uncomfortable is way better than having your business sector closed. How to manage that as a restaurateur, I think, is restaurateurs, that's the business that they're in. They're in the hospitality business. They make people feel comfortable being in their establishment. They provide really good food to eat and drinks. And it's a tough message, but it's a, look, we're all in this together message, and we know it's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's better than being closed. That won't work for everybody, and so, but you got to just kind of shoulder on. We will, if certain folks continue to do that, you know, we'll have to take stronger enforcement action, but we prefer not to do that, obviously, and we have to rely on voluntary compliance.
From Matt Biddle at Delaware State News, how did the situation in Delaware long-term care facilities get so bad? Some data says Delaware has seen a disproportionate share of its deaths in these facilities compared to other states. Why was there a delay in providing testing kits to them?
Yeah, what I know is that, I don't know that compared to other states, but every state it's not been good. And in every state, the highest percentage of those who've succumbed to the COVID-19 virus have been elderly members of our community that are frail, physically frail. And a significant number and proportion of them are in nursing homes. I think the other reality is that the people in nursing homes work in several nursing homes. They often don't get paid a lot of money, so they need to work. Maybe they're feeling a little bit sick, and so they come to work anyway because they need the money, when maybe they should have stayed home because they had the virus. You know, that what I do know is that as we move forward, this is where we really have to lean into. And we need better cooperation from nursing homes and nursing home workers to make sure we get it right. And we're working on that. Is it going as fast as I would like it? No. It's my responsibility to make sure that it happens faster, and that it's my responsibility to make sure that we get better cooperation on both sides, and that this is something that we lean into. There's responsibility on both sides, and that responsibility needs to be shouldered and followed through on. And that's my job to make sure that that happens.
From Jake Owens at Delaware Business Times, we reported this week about Wilmington's largest company's hesitancy to return to offices anytime soon, which will complicate many of the city's small businesses' ability to survive. What are you doing to encourage companies to bring employees back to work to help that trickle-down effect?
Yeah, so companies make their own decisions with respect to that. It's their responsibility for the health and welfare of their employees. Some companies, are able to do the business that they're in better remotely. And, we encourage, our job is to make sure that we work on the public health side of it. You know, people don't want the government to get in the way or do something until they want something done. And then they want the government to do it. This is an issue where it seems to me there's the need for a partnership between business and the government to try to figure that out that's best for the community. Every company is going to be a little bit different. The activity of the week with respect to the protests and public safety is a really, really important part of that equation. And that's why we're trying to get it right. That's why we've spent every minute of every day, it seems like, leaning into that. And that's why how we're going to get it right.
From Melissa Steele at Cape Gazette, in light of the recent protests against police brutality, will the Delaware State Police be reviewing its policy on the use of excessive force?
Yeah, I know they do that all the time. One of the first things that I asked Secretary Koop and Colonel McQueen to do when I was first elected is to think about and to train their men and women in what is known commonly as de-escalation techniques. And it turns out they were already doing it. And they were doing it as an initiative that Governor Markell started. It was in response, sadly, again, to one of these killings. I think it was the Michael Brown incident in Missouri. And it's something that they've incorporated into their training academy and the work that they do, their regular training activity. It's something that we will continue to review again. There needs to be transparency with respect to that, so that the community for whom law enforcement works to protect and secure understands that, and that they know actually what's really going on. I think if you think about what happened on Saturday night as things devolved, I would argue that there was considerable restraint that was exercised on the street. We could have an argument till the cows came home about what was appropriate at what time, and everybody can Monday morning quarterback that kind of thing. And but the reality is that certain activities provoke responses that are worse. And I think that's the whole idea around de-escalation. I don't know, Colonel, if you want to kind of add to that in terms of what your men and women get in terms of training.
Yes, sir. To answer your question, you asked if would we review our policy. So our policy was revamped, and actually we started revamping our academy as it relates to de-escalation, response to resistance in 2015. In 2017, we did a complete overhaul of our use of force policy, and our policy is now in response to resistance. And with that, we also incorporated that in every aspect of what we do. Everything from weapons training to handcuffing, to make that uniform across our policies, to make sure all of our policies are in congruence in terms of how we respond to resistance and what that means for every area, from K-9 training to handcuffing to every aspect of law enforcement training, and incorporated that into our in-service training, as well as our elective training and our recruit training.
And what's interesting is that my guess is that most people that I met with this week have no idea of that. Now, that's part of my job too. Police training is actually something that's not, the certain aspects of it is not something that's shared very publicly, because it in some ways exposes methods and what have you. But to get confidence with situations like this, transparency is important. And it's important that folks understand and know that the men and women in Delaware State Police are trained in these kinds of techniques, and that's all the different things that the Colonel just mentioned, from handcuffing to the use of canines. All those things are part of this ugly history that we see and we hear in the anger on the streets of America over the last week. And so we're trying to do it differently, and agencies across the country are doing it differently. And so most of the men and women that wear the uniform.
And one of the things I share with the governor is certainly, the one thing we find, consistently in law enforcement, and even though we've struggled with this, we've learned that, the people that support law enforcement the most is the people that know the most about us. And we're still sometimes reluctant to share that. Everything when we have from Citizens Police Academies, and we try to get those words out that we want folks to come and learn exactly what we do and how we do what we do. And we haven't been great advocates of, as the governor says, advocating for ourselves sometimes, and we can do a better job of that, of sharing with the public, why we do what we do, and then to get a better understanding of our processes and procedures, and we can do a better job of being more transparent with those.
And Colonel McQueen's going to have the opportunity to continue to work on that as our new Public Safety Secretary.
And this will be the final question from Delaware Public Media. With protests planned this weekend in Dover and Wilmington, what is your message to both the protesters and local businesses?
My message to the protesters is, I hear you. I'm the governor of this state. It's my responsibility to make sure that the rights of every Delawarean are protected. And it's my responsibility to make sure that the relationship between law enforcement and the people of our state gets better, is everything it can be, and is conscious of the ugly history of our state and our country. Because without acknowledging that, you can't really hear or appreciate or understand the anger and frustration. And it's hard to go from that to taking action to address the underlying inequities that persist. And so I think my job, going back to what I said earlier, is to listen first and then to act in conjunction with other leaders, people of goodwill from across our state, to make meaningful change. As my dad used to say, talk is cheap. And as I heard from the protesters we met with today, earlier this week, talk is cheap. And they want to see change, they want to see action. That's what we expect to do. So with that, I just want to ask all the folks that are involved in the protesters to protest, to exercise your First Amendment rights to free speech, but do it peacefully. Do it understanding that ultimately at the end of the day, while it might not feel that way all the time, we are in this together. Again, those of us who serve in elected positions, it's our responsibility. I happen to believe it's the responsibility of leaders right now to turn the temperature down. People say, well, why are you trying to stop protests? I'm not trying to stop protests. I'm trying to avoid what can happen when protests get out of control. I'm trying to find a better way, a way that's more productive. And sometimes you have to go through an experience that's painful to get to the other side. And it's been a painful week. And it's my wish and my prayer that we continue on a peaceful path, and that ultimately we work together because we're in this together. You know, I used to always say, I love the expression that former Governor Markell used to use, that we're a state of neighbors. Well, when your neighbor's hurting, you need to help him or her out. And we got neighbors who are hurting right now. And if we're people of goodwill, and we are, we'll help them out. And in doing so, as the Colonel said, it's a two-way street too. Everybody has to pull their own weight, everybody has to respect each other. And if we do all that, we'll be stronger and we'll be better as a state. Thank you all. Have a safe weekend.